So, welcome back to KLY, a podcast that's dedicated to all things having to do with keeping our youthful appearance. So, I'm your host, Dr. Oscar Hevia, board certified cosmetic dermatologist. Today, we're going to focus on what we can do to maintain our youthful appearance. Our prior episode was talking about how it is that we start to get older and how we start to look older and why. And this episode is going to focus on, well, what can we do to not let that happen? So we're going to focus first, as I had mentioned earlier, looking at the epidermis, which is the top layer of your skin. And I'd shown you prior in that episode that the top layer is extremely thin. So the top layer of our skin is only as thin as this sheet of card paper. And inside this very narrow layer that you see here, super, super tiny, are living cells that we are producing constantly, and these cells grow from the bottom layer to the top. As they get to the top layer of this epidermis, which is our outer layer of our skin, they die, in a sense, and that's what forms a dead layer, and that's what seals in our moisture, and that's what determines to a great degree what is the texture of our skin. Is our skin smooth or is our skin rough? So the epidermal layer, being so thin, is constantly bombarded by the sun, as I mentioned earlier, and that's the number one reason. In fact, 90% of premature aging or aging in general is related to sun exposure. Why is that? Well, because the sun has ultraviolet rays, and those rays are being absorbed by the living cells in this epidermal or outer layer of our skin. And those cells, when they absorb ultraviolet, unfortunately, it's damaging the DNA in those cells. So the center of those cells, the brain of those cells, the part that tells those cells how to behave, how to construct, how to make our skin better, it starts to break down. And when it breaks down, then we start to see different changes visually in our skin as well as functionally in our skin. So looking at the epidermal damage, the sun is enemy number one. So what are some examples of what the sun is doing? Well, as I mentioned in the earlier episode, the sun is causing uneven pigment distribution in that epidermal layer. So the way we see our skin tone and our skin color has to be uniform for it to look youthful. Well, what if it's not? Well, then it's irregular, then it's spotty, then it starts to look weathered. So we want to definitely do some things to try to help in terms of the coloration of our skin to be uniform and not be spotty, uneven, or weathered looking. What else does ultraviolet absorption do? Well, as I said, it damages the DNA of the epidermal cells. It damages the way those cells function. So now they don't start to produce that final dead layer at the top properly. The architecture is off. We are losing water now through our skin cells, through that epidermal layer, and we start to get dry skin. The other thing that happens is this dead layer, the architecture is now not proper, and so what you have is an uneven or irregular skin surface. And the result of that, of course, is that light is bouncing off your face differently, and now instead of getting this smooth, glossy look to your skin because the top dead layer is perfect, you're getting this sort of rough, dull appearance to your skin because that layer is now irregular and uneven. So these are two very obvious ways in which we damage our skin, and the result is older skin. Another great example is the fact that sun damage also starts to damage the openings of our pores, and we start to get larger pores and uneven and irregular and open pores as a result of that exposure. So that's another structural change to the outermost epidermal layer of our skin that is also aging us. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, to the epidermis or the top layer is the fact that we're starting to see different growths develop. So these abnormal skin cells, due to their DNA damage, are starting to now produce growths on this epidermal layer, this outermost layer. So you start to get these things called keratoses, you start to get these other growths that start to happen, and these things contribute to an overall bumpy, irregular, non-smooth, non-clear skin. So these are great examples. So what do we do now to fight that? Well, the first thing you want to do, obviously, is you need to stop getting sun, right? You really need to do something to avoid ultraviolet damage to your skin, because that's affecting the way these skin cells behave and the way your skin therefore looks. So minimizing sun exposure is a huge part. One huge myth in terms of sun exposure is, oh, okay, no problem. I'm just going to put this sunscreen on. It says SPF 1000 and my skin's going to look great and I can be all day out in the sun and it's like nothing ever happened. Well, I hate to tell you, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. So sunscreen is really good at protecting you from preventing a sunburn, which is important, very important, because a sunburn is the ultimate expression of damage to our skin. But unfortunately, it does very little to prevent the things I just described that are happening to our epidermis, our outermost layer. The sunscreen has very little protective effect for that. So what does that mean? That means if you put your sunscreen on and you go out in the sun, you still notice that you got more brown spots. You still notice that your skin color got more uneven. Yes, of course, if you're younger and of course earlier on in life, when you get sun, everything bronzes perfectly, everything tans perfectly, everything looks smooth, and there are no issues. But as the years pass, you will find that your skin's ability to tan and color itself evenly, uniformly, will get worse and worse, and what you will see is a much more irregular pattern. So I mentioned to you earlier about the textural changes. So if you're using sunscreen but you're getting a lot of sun, initially you might find as you're younger that your skin is still smooth, you put on your makeup on, everything looks great, and or you put on moisturizer, everything repairs, everything looks wonderful. But as you get older, you'll find that even though you're using sunscreen, you're not actually getting an improvement in those things. So again, this has to do with the aging process, and do not let yourself think that the sunscreen will give you sufficient protection. What will give you sufficient protection? Well, getting less sun in the first place, or using a wide brim hat. Don't let the sun rays get to your skin directly. Try to do your activities and the things you would do outdoors earlier in the day, later at night, or of course at night, but later in the day or earlier in the morning. Try not to do them in the middle of the day when there's the greatest amount of sun exposure. So if you want your skin to look more youthful, point number one, most importantly, is don't keep damaging it. And if you don't want to keep damaging it, you got to limit the exposure to sunlight. A lot of people will say, well, but I like to get my vitamin D. Yeah, I get it. You can always get vitamin D on your body. You can always produce vitamin D on your body by getting exposed to sunlight on your body. You can get 20, 30 minutes of sun. That's plenty to produce vitamin D naturally. But of course, I ultimately prefer that you supplement your vitamin D if you have an insufficiency, if you don't have enough vitamin D, that you just simply supplement with vitamin D supplementation. That's a better route to go, and just protect your skin and don't let it get damaged to the point that you start to age too quickly or prematurely. So first off, we talked about the sun. Don't get so much sun. That's going to play a huge role. By the way, we didn't touch on the fact that you liked that nice dark color, that you like looking tanned. Please remember that there are ways to look tanned and dark with spray tan in particular, which I think does a really good job. And you can look exactly like you got sun. And that spray tan can last you a good solid week. And no, many of these spray tans, when they're starting to wear out, can come out evenly. You don't have to look patchy brown or patchy orange just because you did a spray tan. So I highly recommend that you do that. If you have a function coming up and you really want to look bronze, you really want to look tan, there's other ways to do it that you're not damaging your skin. So we touched on not getting sun. So what can we do because we have uneven pigmentation, or we have too much darkness on our skin in an uneven manner, lots of spots? So that has to do with damage to the melanocytes, which are the skin cells in that epidermal layer I showed you that are now functioning abnormally, and they're not distributing your color uniformly in your skin. So now you're getting too much over there, but too little over there, and therefore you're starting to look irregular. So one of the best things you can do to help your melanocytes is the use of certain bleaching regimens, certain bleaching agents. I don't like the word bleaching too much because it sort of implies it's turning your skin white. That's not what we're doing. But what we're doing is we're calming down these cells that are damaged, that are producing or overproducing melanin in one area versus the other. So the use of hydroquinone to this day is still an excellent, excellent product to use to help calm down your melanocytes and have them produce less excessive pigment, which will help you get rid of a lot of these different pigmentation issues that you have. In addition to that, retinoids are invaluable to help your skin color become more uniform. So retinoids will get into the nucleus of the melanocyte and help to regulate it and make it start to function more properly again, which means that your melanocytes will start to distribute pigment in a more uniform way and in a less haphazard and spotty way. So the use of retinoids with hydroquinone is a time-proven, tested, excellent method to get your skin tone and your skin coloration to be more uniform. And when I say retinoids, of course, I'm referring to Retin-A, which is tretinoin, which is a prescription product, which is the one that I prefer. But we're also talking about retinol, which is the over-the-counter version of Retin-A, which can do a pretty good job. And in some cases, you can have retinal, which is another chemical derivative of these retinoids that is also over-the-counter. But these products used with hydroquinone are excellent. And of course, I suggest you talk to your dermatologist about what is the best exact regimen for you to help you with your pigmentation, or as we like to say, dyspigmentation, which means that your coloration is off. With respect to texture changes to your skin, which has to do with your outer layer, this epidermis being rough and dry and dull, the most important thing we can do there is exfoliation. Now, there's a million ways to exfoliate, but why are we exfoliating? Well, exfoliation helps to get your skin cells to once again renew and get themselves lined up again the way they always have been structurally, so that when the dead layer forms at the top of your skin, the structure and the component of a dead layer is much more uniform and smooth. And again, as we get that dead layer to be more smooth and proper in its architecture, the better the light's going to bounce off, the more glossy your skin's going to look, the more smooth your skin's going to look, and of course the smoother and softer your skin is going to feel. So we definitely want to try to re-regulate. We want to get our skin cells to start doing their job better again. So the best way to do this is through exfoliation and the use of retinoids, because once again, retinoids get into the nucleus of the cell and they tell the cell, hey, you have to start doing your job properly. You have to start building this dead zone or this dead layer in the proper architecture, and it helps to differentiate, or basically that's our fancy word for telling the skin cell to get back to doing its job properly. So retinoids are wonderful for that. And the other thing is the use of exfoliants. Now, exfoliation just means that we're basically moving along or helping to improve the natural process in which our skin cells migrate to the top dead layer and then they slough. And there's a natural process. It takes about 6 weeks normally from when these skin cells in the epidermis are first being made to the point that they reach the top layer and then they slough off. When we have damaged epidermis and damaged skin cells, what happens is that process is abnormal. One of the first things that happens is that the dead layer starts to get uneven and irregular, and it starts to thicken, but in an uneven manner. In addition to that, as I mentioned to you before, the cells aren't basically bridging to each other or connecting to each other properly, so you're having water loss. So exfoliation kind of helps to move that process along, and it helps to keep the skin cells uniform, and it helps to keep that dead layer proper and smooth. So exfoliation is another huge process. And of course, that's a vast, vast area. We can exfoliate our skin by using abrasive products, which are minimally helpful, by the way. I prefer exfoliation treatments that are functionally changing the way those skin cells in the epidermis are behaving, so that you get the most structural support to that dead layer, and therefore it functions best, you look best, and your skin works best. There are ways to exfoliate where you're just simply doing things to the top layer. If you're applying an acid that's very mild, you're basically helping the shedding of the top layer, which is an abnormal layer for people that have sun damage, so that's okay. It's okay to shed that abnormal layer, but ultimately we want to get into the cells that are even producing that abnormal layer and get them to function and work better. So as I mentioned before, the use of retinoids on a regular basis helps to realign that process of how our cells normally go from the bottom layer all the way to the top dead layer. It helps to realign how they work together with each other and how they produce the various layers in our skin. That's going to make our skin look as smooth and soft and glossy as possible. So I mentioned the architecture of this layer of skin that's so important, the epidermis. I mentioned about the coloration and how we want to make that uniform and how we want to make the texture smooth and soft. I did mention slightly about skin growths on the epidermal layer and how these cells actually start to produce abnormal bumps and growths that you see on people. And also the sebaceous glands start to enlarge and the pores that we form on our skin start to become larger. So all of this has to do with, again, skin cells that have been damaged due to ultraviolet exposure, and now they're not doing their job and they're not creating the proper architecture for how we put our skin together. And the proper architecture means that our pores, the opening to our pores, are very fine and small, but unfortunately they can enlarge. So enlargement of the pores has to do with damage to the cells that are lining the pores, which has to do with ultraviolet exposure, as well as damage to the sebaceous glands with enlargement of the sebaceous glands, and this also tends to enlarge the pores. Also, we never forget hormonal factors, and of course genetic factors play a big role in the pores. But you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that one of the best treatments for the pores and enlargement of the openings of the pores is retinoids. Once again, retinoids help to regulate the size of the sebaceous glands, help to regulate the skin cells, most importantly, that are lining the pores, and then genetics will play a role. If you do have some hormonal issues, that primarily occurs, of course, during adolescence, and then that's when we tend to get acne as well, because now we're affecting the whole sebaceous gland and we're affecting the pore. And that's a whole other topic that technically really doesn't have anything to do with aging. But again, the emphasis here is on retinoids and exfoliation, because once again, exfoliation can also help us to shed those skin cells that are inside the pore that are starting to get plugged, that are starting to create an enlargement of the opening at the surface. So exfoliation will play a role there. So if we want younger skin, the first thing we want to do is don't get too much sun. That's huge. That's first. Secondly, we want to use retinoids to help us with the distribution of the color so that it's more uniform, to help us with our dead layer so that our dead layer is more sealed and soft and smooth. And then we also want to use it to even help our pores. And then lastly, exfoliation keeps our skin cells rejuvenating, keeps our skin cells renewing, and helps to keep the whole architecture of the epidermis in good shape. Okay, so in the second part of our discussion on the aging skin, I also mentioned the dermis, which is the layer that is just below your epidermis. So I mentioned to you that the epidermis is an extremely thin layer. It's on the top. We already discussed all the things that are happening there and the fact that the epidermis is incredibly thin. So now I'm going to talk to you briefly about the dermis. And the dermis is represented by this yellow layer here. And to give you a sense of the relative difference in thicknesses between the epidermis, which is super thin, and the dermis, which is also quite thin. And this is a good representation of the thickness of the dermis in, for example, the face. Different parts of your body will have different thicknesses of this yellow layer represented. Again, we're saying that this is the dermis. So, for example, as you get to your eyelids, the dermis can almost be the thickness of the epidermis, extremely thin. But as we get to other parts, like for example our back, the dermis, this yellow layer can actually be much thicker. So when we see changes to, how do we see damage to the dermis and what kind of aging issues occur? The first issue with the dermis that I want to comment on has to do with expression. So and I'm of course focusing on our face. So as we express and smile and do all the things we do, that is creating a stress force to some extent on that layer I just showed you, which is the dermis, which is where our collagen is located, our collagen fibers. It's also where our elastic fibers are located, and it's also where we have hyaluronic acid gel, which is the gel that we all know of as that fillers have, but we also have it in our joints. And it's just a soft, viscous gel that also is responsible for attracting water. So basically the dermis is broken down to, in a very simplistic way, collagen fibers, elastic fibers, hyaluronic acid gel. The dermis is also, by the way, where the blood vessels are located. So whether we look very pink, whether we look red, whether we have a nice youthful hue, or whether we don't have much color at all these things have to do a lot with what kind of blood flow is happening, what type of circulation is happening in the dermis of the skin. So the first aging process that we see in the dermis of the skin is dynamic wrinkles. So of course you know that as crow's feet, which occur out here, or frown lines, which occur between the brows, etc. So these types of lines that we start to see in people have to do with the fact that they're living long enough and they're expressing long enough that after a while it starts to affect that collagen layer of the skin, the dermis. And it starts to create actually a full impression on the dermis, and that's why you end up with these lines. So of course, the treatment, we're not going to tell you that you should never express, you should never talk, and you should just be a mannequin, in which case you won't get these lines. So this is, of course, where Botox comes to play. So Botox is this incredible toxin that was created in nature that on the large scale, if ingested, can create all kinds of issues. But when we use it on the most tiniest of scales and in the most precise manner, we can literally take the expression muscles that are creating these wrinkles or lines and tell them to stop contracting at that area. And by doing that, the skin actually smooths out. So this is the miracle of Botox. I know all of you are familiar with Botox. I'm sure everyone's familiar with how it works. But when it's placed strategically where it needs to be placed for these muscles that are creating these expression lines, you will get a smoothing of the skin. Of course, if enough years pass and these wrinkles from expression are deep enough, then you cannot fully eliminate them with Botox, because even though you relax the skin where those wrinkles are forming, you will still have some sort of permanent, let's say, depression or line there. And so then we have to use other tricks of the trade, such as, for example, filler works really nice for most of these expression lines to fill in that wrinkle because it's progressed to a point that it's now too deep. But in most people, easily in their 20s and 30s, when these lines are first forming and they're fairly narrow and they're fairly superficial, it's very easy to just use Botox, usually roughly about twice a year, to keep these lines from forming. And the nice thing about Botox in this context is that if you do it regularly and you do it over a period of your 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on, you will actually never develop those wrinkles because those wrinkles are not forming and therefore they don't develop. So that's one really cool thing about Botox. And of course, by the way, when I say Botox, I'm referring to neurotoxins, which is a scientific term for these products, and that includes other products like Dysport, Xeomin, Jeuveau, Daxxify, etc. And there will probably be many more in the market in the near future. But these all have the same active botulinum toxin active ingredient, which is responsible for relaxing the expression muscles in the face. So again, that is the earliest typical aging process that we see in the dermis. And I'm sure you all have seen many, many examples of how these wrinkles can smooth out. There are certain areas of the face, of course, that we cannot use Botox, even though we are developing expression lines there. And the reason is that if you stop that muscle that's creating that expression line, then the person's going to look very strange, unnatural, and it's not going to look good. So a great example are the smile lines that start to form out here after the corner of the mouth, for example. If you were to say, well, I'm going to put Botox there because I don't want that person to have a smile line there, then they won't be smiling properly, and that's not acceptable, and that's not going to be natural. So we don't use Botox in that context. So there are certain rare examples where you have expression lines in the face that we would not use Botox because that it's not an option. And the reason is that it's not going to look natural when we stop those muscles from working. I do want to mention one really important thing about Botox. Botox is not an all or none treatment. It does not mean that you either go from no effect to total paralysis effect, total freezing effect, and you look like a mannequin. That's not how it works. So Botox can be, in the manner it's injected and to the amount that it's injected, it can be used in a way that will give you degrees of smoothing and degrees of muscle control so that it can look very natural and the person can look very relaxed. Remember that the most important thing in which we accomplish when we do these treatments is to make the person look relaxed and refreshed. The single biggest effect of aging on anyone is that they look tired and worn out, and the effect of these treatments and reversing these processes and making someone look more youthful, the principal effect is that they look more rested and refreshed. And that is our goal. As long as you're doing that, you're never going to look unnatural and it's never going to look strange. So we touched on the dynamic lines in the dermis. Now we can and do affect the elastic fibers in the dermis, and that has nothing to do with how much expressing someone's doing. Unfortunately, that also has to do with exposure to sunlight, absorption of ultraviolet in the cells that are responsible. They're called fibroblasts that make elastic fibers, that make collagen fibers. These cells are also damaged by absorption of ultraviolet light, and these cells also will start to function abnormally. Not only will they start to produce abnormal collagen fibers, but they will actually, the process of, in this dermis, these fibers will be degraded or broken down more rapidly once we have the stimulus of ultraviolet radiation absorption in the dermis. So now we start to break down these fibers that are so important to the strength, resiliency, and elasticity of our skin. So what happens there, of course, as we start to affect elastic fibers, we start to get sagging. And as we affect the collagen fibers, we also get sagging as well. So the dreaded sagging is first and foremost due to sun exposure and first and foremost due to the absorption of ultraviolet light by the nucleus of the cells in the dermis that are responsible for keeping our dermis structurally sound. Another effect of ultraviolet exposure in the dermis has to do with, I mentioned before, our circulation. So either you can have over time a drop in the blood vessel formation in the dermis, which makes the skin look dull and drab, or you can have a situation where now there's an abnormal proliferation of blood vessels in the dermis or in the dermal layer, which can create uneven coloration of the skin. So earlier I talked about in the epidermis where the pigment is, but you can also have abnormal or irregular distribution of blood vessels in the dermis, which can cause too much redness but in an uneven pattern. So that's a very typical look of weathered skin, which is that both the brown spots are spread out unevenly and it does not look good. And then you can also have on top of that red splotchiness all over. In some places not enough red, not enough hue, not enough color, dull, and in other places too much redness. And this together with the brown creates an uneven distribution of color in the skin, which is very aging to patients. So getting back to what I was saying before, we talked about dynamic wrinkles in the dermis. We talked about how Botox fixes that for the most part. But when we talk about elastic changes, and when we talk about changes to the dermal fibers, the collagen fibers and elastic fibers in the skin, this results in sagging skin. This results in sometimes thinning skin and even uneven or irregular skin, because the last insult of ultraviolet exposure to our dermal layer in our skin is abnormal collagen fiber structure. So what happens is these collagen fibers that are normally smooth and evenly placed start to get clumped. And so what you see there is this sort of cobblestoning of the skin, which is so typical of skin that had sun exposure over many years. So you get this And this has nothing to do with that top layer I told you about, the epidermis, and all of what happens there with dry and uneven skin. Now we're talking about the dermal layer, sort of the foundation, structural layer. Now that also becomes uneven, irregular, and you get that orange peel texture to the skin, and you get that cobblestoning to the skin. So a lot of these structural abnormalities can be improved on by forcing the skin to remodel itself. And the best way we can get the skin to remodel itself is through the use of different treatments that cause an injury, which then forces the skin to remodel itself and go back to its original blueprint of making things smoother. So in this case, we talk about resurfacing. And we can resurface the skin by the application of, for example, an acid, which is a chemical peel, which forces the skin to then repair itself from the effect of the peel. Or we can do it through a number of different lasers we have that do the same effect, where basically they're creating a very controlled injury to the skin, getting down into that dermal layer where this damage is. And then the skin says, oh, we got to repair, we have to fix. And in doing so, when it repairs and fixes, it helps to remodel all these abnormalities that we see in the skin. That's number one. Number two, of course, we can use fillers to help to counteract the sagging, the falling, the folds that start to form. So strategic use of filler, proper use of filler in the right areas of the face to kind of relift and help to resupport the skin, fill in folds, fill in wrinkles. All of those things can be done with fillers, which creates a very natural and a very youthful appearance. So we try to get the skin to remake itself up to a point, because it can only do so much, by resurfacing it with, for example, chemical peels or lasers. And then we can also help to add back the structural loss to the skin by the use of fillers properly placed, properly done, to give the skin more of that youthful structural look that it had before, to get your contour back to where it was. I do want to mention one last layer or area of the skin that's also affected by aging, and in this case the sun rays don't quite get down this deep, but this has to do with the fat layer. And as we age, we do lose fat on the face. As you might imagine, as we age, fat gets redistributed throughout the entire body. So we lose it in the face, we gain it in certain parts of the body. Those of you who are a little bit older know exactly what I'm talking about. So redistribution of fat. And one of the unfortunate things that happens with redistribution of fat is that the face develops a lot of different hollow areas or sunken areas. So the sinking or hollowness of the face in certain regions contributes to the sagging and the loss of elasticity of the skin. So those things are happening at the same time in two different layers. So we do have lots of tricks. Again, we do use fillers. They work quite well, but we also have biostimulators such as Sculptra, for example, to inject into these fat layers that will help to restore the volume that your face has lost. And when the face loses volume in certain areas of the face, it will definitely make the face look more tired and more saggy. And for this reason, we replace with either filler and or biostimulators such as Sculptra. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Keep Looking Young, where we really focused in on what things we can do to help ourselves look youthful and why we do what we do to stay youthful and refreshed. Please feel free to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Oscar Hevia. That's Dr. Oscar Hevia.